Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christian Dickson, and on this show, we're going to bring you into the minds of experts and thought leaders supporting and within state and local government. From GovInvest and AdastraGov, this is GovTalk, a new podcast about government, finance, and labor, and how they are impacted by current events. It's Thursday, March 26th. Over the next few episodes, we'll be covering COVID-19 and how governments are being affected by it. Using recorded interviews, live conversations, and active feedback from you, the viewers, we will offer insights from subject matter experts around the impacts of COVID-19 to state and local government. On today's episode, our guests are Charlie Francis and Eric Weeks. Some of you may know or may have worked with Charlie and Eric in consultations or in planning meetings, but today, our guests are here to share their experiences in working through past economic collapses. Today, our viewers are finance and human resources professionals, executive managers, and elected leaders from governments across the country. For those of you joining us live today, we will be posing questions that you can answer throughout the presentation. On your screen now, you will find instructions on how to vote and answer questions. We also encourage questions by you, the viewers, to be posted in the chat feed. Some questions will be selected at the end of the episode for our experts to answer directly. To start the episode, we're going to introduce our guests. First, Charlie Francis has more than 45 years of local government financial management experience in both public and private sectors, including 20 years as Chief Financial Officer. Starting his career in 1971, Charlie worked as a sales tax revenue auditor for the Illinois Department of Revenue. After a year, he moved to Colorado, where he was an accountant for the Denver Urban Renewal Authority. 3 years later, the city of Loveland hired him as an assistant finance director. Charlie's career moved him to Treasure Island, Florida, where he was appointed there as a finance director. And in 1988, Charlie made his way to California to lead finance as CFO for the city of Tracy, Indian Wells, and Sausalito. During his time in California, Charlie also worked as CFO for San Francisco and Berkeley housing authorities. Now, after a long career in government finance and supporting agencies around the country, Charlie continues his support by providing consulting advice to government GovTech companies and their clients, helping to build and deliver mission-critical software and services. Also with us today is Eric Weeks, who has worked for 13 years as a consulting actuary for Milliman & Robertson and Mercer Human Resources consulting firms. Following his career as an actuary, Eric worked for a large non-for-profit hospital system in Portland, Oregon, for almost 14 years, the last 5 of which he managed more than 600 physicians and associated clinics as vice president. After a short retirement, Eric joined AdastraGov as a consultant, where he now helps support state and local governments across the country in modeling, budgeting, and negotiating their labor costs. Thank you both for joining me today. Now, first I have Charlie. Charlie, as the viewers respond to the first question on their screen, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your experience in managing through times of crisis. Charlie, are you there?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on this webcast with you today. I believe that we're going to be able to share some valuable information with our audience, and I'm humbled that you asked me to be a guest along with Eric Weeks. You know, as a finance director for the past 45 years, I have been through 4 recessions, 1980 to 82, 1990 to 91, the 2001 recession, and 2008 2009. And I've also been through 3 major natural disasters: Hurricane Elena in 1985, the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989, and the Landers earthquake in 1992. If you advance the slide, please. I've always seen my finance director role as having 4 major responsibilities. Not only just preserving value, we protect the public purse, reporting value, the timely and accurate financial reporting. But I see my role as enabling value and creating value for my organizations. And so in the spirit of how the past can inform the present, I'm really looking forward today to sharing with our audience what I've learned from these difficult times as a CFO and how I've applied these four major responsibilities in disasters and in recessions.
So Charlie, tell me, what do you see happening today with the coronavirus crisis, through the lens of a former local government finance director?
Oh, sure. Many local governments, including the cities I managed, they properly plan, prepare, and practice for natural disasters, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, mudslides, and that gives them a great advantage when a disaster strikes. And also, many governments plan, prepare, and they're ready for recessions by focusing on strategic long-term financial planning and developing strong reserve policies and having fiscal emergency plans, as did I. But when you bring these two together, in other words, an international natural disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic, and an immediate and violent economic shock, a sudden shutdown of life and business as we know it, well, in these unprecedented magnitudes, we're in the epicenter of a local government perfect financial storm.
It's interesting, Charlie. So from your experience, how do you respond to such a situation?
Oh my goodness, today we are faced with having all those contingency plans that we had in place, and they're colliding with this reality of this perfect financial storm. For example, we have economists predicting all kinds of different recoveries, from a V-shaped recovery to a U-shaped, to a long U-shaped, to an L-shaped recovery. And we'll talk a little bit later about what those means. But events are unfolding so rapidly. Go ahead and move forward through this. Recessions is going to be unusually difficult to fight. The next click will show us that the Standard & Poor's in their recent government bond update is predicting a recession, as is the International Monetary Fund. Go ahead and click through. We have all kinds of news coming out through CalPERA, through CSMFO. A recession is here, and it's unfolding differently from the disaster and economic scenarios that we used to create the contingency plans we had in place. So flexibility and creativity are needed to adapt our responses. Financial management in a crisis needs to be adaptable, flexible, and creative in finding solutions to the many problems and the challenges that inevitably will surface. And by doing so, by meeting these challenges, we will instill much needed credibility and trust with our elected officials and our citizens who are looking to us, the finance professionals, to lead them in a crisis. So let's summarize actions that finance directors are doing right now in response to the disaster. First, they need to manage cash flow. They're managing cash flow. They prepared for liquidity. Liquidity is key for paying overtime, buying supplies, paying vendors, and meeting payroll. We need cash because our procurement systems must be adapted to permit as needed purchasing and as needed contracting. Supply chains need to be kept open, or we even need plans on commandeering and paying for supplies from closed non-essential businesses. Remote workers need to have connectivity to networks to use existing software systems for accounting, records management, and subsequent audits, and all that has to be purchased. In addition, our costs need to be tracked for FEMA reimbursement. Grants must be monitored to secure funding for emergency operations. So all of us are probably activating and using our disaster accounting general ledger lines that allow jurisdictions to track costs precisely, report them to agencies for reimbursement, and conduct that detailed reporting and analysis. We're logging and tracking all our personnel time and expenses. That requires accurate and detailed records of time and cost associated with response action if we're going to get the reimbursement from FEMA and other agencies for all the associated costs that are incurred for actions taken during a response or recovery. Emergency procurements and contracts are being activated. Pre-existing contracts really help tremendously to expedite response operations. And But those pre-existing contracts still must follow the federal procurement rules and state requirements. So emergency procurements and contracts simply expedite the process to procure the fast contract performance. We have to document all our equipment and materials used during the response activities, and that's accurate documentation. All expenditures related to the response and disaster impacts. Again, using those general ledger line items to document everything, that allows us to justify each expenditure and directly relate it to the incident response, as well as differentiating our response costs from general operational costs occurred concurrently with the response. We have to document all damage and cost impacts. Damage will occur as we're converting facilities to meet the disaster and the emergency, compiling our costs and our expense financial data, and adjusting our contracting and procurement policies to account for increased emergency expenditures. These are all items that are listed in the FEMA website, which I encourage everyone to go to, as the necessary steps that you will need and our agencies are going through right now to make sure that they'll be reimbursed for all their financial activities as it pertains to this crisis. I think we want to ask our audience a poll now. How many agencies have opened their emergency operations center? Well, it looks like the majority of us have opened up our emergency operations center. Okay, and that means we're in our emergency operation plans. We've dusted off those manuals that we've rehearsed, and that's good. You know, at the same time that we're going through all of the steps that I just mentioned above, we have to start thinking about our continuity of operations through the lens of our fiscal capacity. So I recently posted an article on LinkedIn that we have to start tracking our current year budget to actual projections, and then we have to forecast them to include the immediate and precipitous drop in revenues we're experiencing from shutting down the economy. We have to reopen our mid-year budget adjustments that we may have already presented to our city councils and say, what's the impact? Let's forecast the impact of overtime with our first line responders. Our use of reserve policies must be reviewed at this time, and if elected official approval is needed because of legal levels of control over budget appropriations, or elected official approval is needed to expend reserves, we need to arrange for that as well. And what adds to this complexity is that emergency meetings may have to be done, but now they may have to be done remotely due to the shelter-in-place orders, which means you need to have legal review over what can be done for posting public meetings. And fortunately, in California, a lot of the Brown Act requirements have been dropped that allow us to do that. You know, at some point, we may reach where reserves aren't adequate to provide services through the end of the fiscal year. And local governments might have to start making those hard decisions on what is essential personnel and what are non-essential personnel, and who's needed and not needed to continue business for this crisis to get us through.
Charlie, that seems like there's a lot more to think about than maybe a civilian might consider. And some things that we've been looking at is there's a lot of talk about recovery. How do you plan scenarios for this event?
We need to take the base budget that we are just revising. In other words, revisiting our current year budget to actual projections, then projecting that out till the end of the year, and identify the factors that are driving this forecast. What are the pressures on each jurisdiction's revenues and spending levels? And then after we create this baseline forecast with our service levels, now we have to start testing alternative outcomes. And I think we need to include both optimistic and pessimistic revenue scenarios, including a lengthy recession or a black swan depression. These are things that must be considered. Now, we need to build the costs into our baseline budget to make our current level of service sustainable over time, and we have to test the impact of our service level increases, decreases, tied to our agency's priorities and goals. And then last, have to put together a fiscal emergency plan. In other words, recommending policies and corrective actions that we need to take in order to provide for continuity of services. You know, there's just so much uncertainty that these long-term forecasts may seem nearly impossible right now. Yet we have to think through some of these scenarios and model them. Many economists are forecasting a U-shaped recovery. We have to ask ourselves and come to a conclusion and recommendation: how long will we be quarantined? How long before life gets back to normal? With many businesses could be failing due to this mandatory closing, and our economies, our local economies, could take months, years, or even decades to recover. So we have to start thinking, what local government services will we still be able to provide with a complete change in our economy? And then we have to also take into consideration, we have an outdated taxing and funding structure for local government. Will that stay the same? How will that change, and how long will it take to be implemented? So I kind of emphasize scenarios rather than forecasting, because forecasting is typically just an exercise in extrapolation. We look at the past, how it's in fact affected the present, and then we extrapolate out into the future with different assumptions. But in scenario planning, we have to look at the different scenarios of what we think the outcome is going to be and work backwards to from that scenario on how we're going to, what kind of revenues that will generate, and from there, what kind of services are we able to provide. Well, and I see three potential scenarios unfolding. A return to normal relatively quickly, a slow recovery, or the black swan event. So let me go through some of these really quick. Under a return to normal scenario, the coronavirus is brought under control swiftly. Our economic impacts kind of go back to, we say, oh, it's just going to come back to the same assumptions that we were using before. So our local domestic product resumes, the economy snaps back, and we just use our existing assumptions on financial growth in our city. Our taxes are going to return to their normal pattern of seasonal fluctuation, and our expenditures return to those negotiated contracts that we have in place for labor, services, supplies, debt, and capital spending. But I do want to just kind of bring to the forefront of everyone's thinking that even with the recovery today, we're still looking at, you know, a 20% drop in the stock market. We don't know how this is going to play out for all of our pension plans, but more than likely, we should be predicting that we will not be reaching the expected rates of return or the discount rate assumption that was assumed in our pension plans. And this is going to have a really big impact on our pension obligations 2 years from now, as those the stock market drop plays through the actuarial analysis and then comes into how much we're going to be charged. So keep in mind, even with the normal slow recovery, we're probably going to have a long-term impact because of the pension. So the next scenario is where, no, let's go stay with slow recovery, is where people and businesses don't just reduce spending and investment in the short term, but they're less willing or even less able to spend for months or even years after that. So in this scenario, the base year is forecast using the government's revised assumptions on economic and financial growth. In other words, the dip in the economy is sustained, the recovery is static to slow, and rebounds in an incremental gradual return sometime in the future. In other words, taxes are not expected to return to normal patterns of seasonal fluctuation, but to generate resources at the lower bands of revenue fluctuation for years. Contracts for labor are all renegotiated along with your contracts for service supplies, debt, and capital spending to conform to resource availability. Again, we have to keep in mind that even in a slow recovery, we're going to be seeing increased amortization payments due to the UAL because of the stock market performance. You know, and I just want to, before we go to the next slide, just want to remind everyone, if you see a 20% drop in the stock market, well, to get back to the prior levels requires a 25% increase. So, I mean, that's a pretty big increase in equity performance. And, you know, it's just something to keep in mind. It will not be easy for all of our pension plans to achieve their assumed discount rate. And finally, the black swan event, a deep, deep recession or depression. I believe that we should model this and be prepared for each jurisdiction to what we might be able to expect in terms of revenues and what services are we going to be providing for. And, you know, all of us should have gone to the GFOA website. They have a fabulous recovery website right now. They have a comprehensive catalog of first aid techniques. And I think our elected officials need to be considering today what public functions will need to be cut, slashed, or trimmed in the future because our revenue generation is going to be so significantly impacted in a black swan event. So anyway, that's where I see is happening, could happen, and I think that those are kind of the minimum 3 scenarios that we should plan for as we move forward.
So Charlie, you know, you're talking a lot about scenario forecasting, scenario building, and the different scenarios that might take place. But what about bailout? How do you see the financial help for state and local governments?
Yeah, there's a lot of optimism out there with the bailout. I just want to remind everyone that ICMA recently posted that local governments alone will spend $20 billion on COVID-19 related actions. And for example, King County in Washington has already spent $50 million, while the little city of Westerville, Ohio spent $7.5 million so far, just in the span of a week. So there's a lot of ambiguity out there still for state, local, and tribal governments. And top of the mind for most leaders and stakeholders is, well, how and when is grant funding going to be available to combat the health and economic impacts? So, you know, in March, the Office of Management and Budget issued a new executive memorandum that expands the scope of recipients affected by the loss of operational capacity and increased costs. Well, guess what? That's all of us. Their federal agencies are able now to offer relief for administrative, financial management, and audit requirements. So some of the latest provisions include, you know, the System for Award Management, or SAM, registration or renewal. Now you'll be able to apply for grants without having to go through the SAM registration process. And for those of you who have gone through the SAM registration process, you know how laborious and tortuous that is. For those of you that have not, if the grants come, you're going to be able to apply for it, but you will have to be registered before the grant is awarded. So I highly encourage you to start your SAM registrations now. Federal agencies will have flexibility with application deadlines. Each one will have their own flexibility, so we need to stay on top of that. The notice of funding opportunities is going to be shortened. So a federal agency may come up with a grant, and instead of the notice of funding opportunity, it could be less than 30 days to get an application in there. So we need to stay on top of that also. And at the end of the next 2 slides, I'll show you what sites to monitor so that we're always looking at this. They're going to be providing no-cost extensions on expiring awards, on non-competitive continuation grants will only require, you'll be able to resume and restore your project activities and acceptance of the contribution award if requests are made between April 1st and December 31st. You only need a brief statement. Expenditures for salaries and other project activities. Agencies may allow recipients to continue paying salaries consistent with our local government policy under unexpected or extraordinary circumstances, and other costs can be charged to the award if necessary to resume project activities. We do have to continue to document those costs though, the time and effort. Number 7, allowability of costs not normally charged to awards. Agencies may allow recipients to charge costs incurred by cancellations of grant-related events, travel, and other activities. So keep track of any grant, event, travel, or other activity that you weren't able to go to. If you incurred a cost with that, you may be able to be reimbursed for that. Some requirements may be allowed to allow the recipient to address the response more effectively, and they will waive prior approval as long as the costs remain consistent with cost principles and guidelines. And procurement requirements like geographic location and small and minority businesses, et cetera, may be waived by some of the federal agencies. Financial performance and other reporting, this executive memorandum allows for an additional 3 months to submit, and drawdowns will not be interrupted if the delay is allowed by the agency. So, you know, they're giving us a lot of flexibility with these 13 items in the executive memorandum, including extension of currently approved indirect cost rates, extension of the closeouts, and extension of single audit submissions. You know, the recipient should receive a 6-month extension beyond the normal due date. So awarding agencies will be posting guidance, and they'll be contacting recipients to alert them of the relaxed requirements, and more information is going to be coming from the administration. So we should all be looking for that. That's where are the funds that coming from? Well, according to data by ICMA, the latest COVID-19 reimbursement and stimulus funding for state and local government will be primarily channeled through FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, SBA, the Small Business Administration, and the Center for Disease Control. So at FEMA level, rather than having to declare an emergency, we're eligible to apply for public assistance from FEMA, but the FEMA assistance will be provided at a 75% federal cost share and requires the execution of a FEMA-state tribal territory agreement. So in other words, local governments and other eligible applicants must apply through their respective state, tribal, or territorial jurisdiction in order to get public assistance from FEMA. Under the President's National Emergency Declaration, FEMA has about $40 billion of disaster relief to support state and local governments in their response efforts, including the opportunity to apply direct federal assistance, temporary facilities, commodities, equipment, and emergency operation costs. Small Business Administration loans, the SBA has announced that it will provide $7 billion of disaster assistance for small businesses affected by COVID-19. This should help our local economies recover, and they're up to $2 million per loan, which must be repaid, but the interest rates are relatively low, 3 3/4% for eligible small businesses and 2 3/4% for nonprofits, like your chambers of commerce and other organizations in the city might be able to get some of this disaster loan assistance. And the loans can be used to pay fixed debts and payroll as well. And finally, CDC funding, there's about $8.3 billion, which that are kind of $950 million of which are used for grants for 2 cooperative agreements with state and local governments, so as well as health service providers. So keep in mind that a lot of this money has to be allocated within 30 days. So again, we need to be watching these resources. So where do we go to watch it? That's the next slide. The best way to quickly apply for and implement the funding that is available is to first and foremost stay informed. The following resource can help you stay on top of all the latest COVID-19. The resource guide to coronavirus for government leaders is hosted by Government Technology. Dustin Hazler has compiled a comprehensive list of COVID-19 facts and resources specifically for federal, state, and local government agencies, including dashboards tracking the spread of the disease, as well as example state and local responses. So this list is being updated on a continual basis. And, you know, if you go to www.govtech.com, you'll be able to find the resource guide highlighted on their webpage. And then ICMA has just a wonderful coronavirus resource page as well, icma.org/coronavirus. The International City, it includes the latest COVID-19 news, includes practical tips to make use of funding, and also information on how to carefully document and stay up to date on all the latest federal procurement requirements.
So Charlie, you have a lot of experience in the GovTech community and adopting new tools when you were working as a finance director. Let's talk a little bit more about that support. What tools?
Sure. Yeah, the staff working remotely, the work of government must go on. Budgets still have to be prepared. Financial statements must be issued. Audits have to be conducted. Day-to-day accounting must be sustained. And today we have available to us remote cloud-based technologies that help us facilitate this new working paradigm. So I kind of see that IT and software expenses will increase. We need to monitor these funding sources to look and see how much of them can we get reimbursed for. But you know, let me give you an example. If we're going to go through right-sizing decisions, our organizations, because our new economy isn't going to be able to sustain the current levels of service, we need software that accurately calculates the cost of labor. We need software that will help us work and collaborate in the cloud as we're preparing our budgets, as we're managing our audit, as we're, you know, no more bookcases with binders and sticky notes in them to what it used to be our debt management software. Now there's software in the cloud to help us work remotely and actually create a virtual office place for all of our employees. It's going to be critical. So along the way, all of us are going to be developing our own creative and nimble responses. We need to have a dialogue together on how we adapted to our unique situational service needs, and tell stories about how your flexibility allowed you to meet yet another obstacle. And I encourage all of us to use your social media to talk about these things. Use your state organization listservs. We want others to learn and apply the solutions to our operational challenges. So I encourage you all to, learn about these new tools, share your experiences, call us. We have our hands on what all these different cloud-based technologies are and how they can all be brought together to, so that you can continue delivering, your excellent financial management policies, procedures, and work plans.
Charlie, that's fantastic insight. I really do appreciate you taking the time to explain that to the viewers here. Do you have any closing comments?
Well, I know I talked really fast, so I'm hoping that we'll be able to share the presentation, with everyone later. And I apologize for talking too fast. But I do have a summary comment. Strategic financial management is a cycle, and it all comes down to tying everything we do back to our strategic plan and our goals and priorities. So, for example, when I was managing every policy decision, every fiscal impact section of the staff report, every action that the city council take, I would model back in my current year budget to actual software to produce a new base year. And then that new base year fed my long-term financial plan. So my brand with this city was always, sooner or later, it always comes down to money. City manager, elected officials, here's the impact of that policy decision on your strategic plan vision for this community. And so that, not that I wanted them to not make decisions, I just wanted them to have the evidence and the data to inform their decisions. So, you know, I just want to emphasize that long-term financial planning, budgeting, monitoring, calibrating, strategic planning is the heart of strategic financial management. Today, our local government chief financial officers, they must enact their disaster procedures. They need to reassess their current financial position. We have to forecast scenarios, all with the limited resources that that'll be coming into the cities. We have to do this effectively and efficiently. And then if we share the results, then we're all going to rise up for this together. So, you know, please use all the resources available. And thank you today for allowing me to present with this. And of course, I'm standing by for any questions we might have.
Fantastic, Charlie. And thank you again from behalf of myself and the viewers for taking the time to take us to the mind of a finance director and how the governments can be thinking about their financial reaction to COVID-19. Now, to understand more about healthcare effects on hospitals and what labor changes may come from the COVID pandemic, we have with us Eric Weeks. Thanks for taking the time, Eric.
Hi, thank you, Christian. I'm Eric Weeks. I do not have the deep government experience that Charlie has shared with us, but I would like to offer some things that I've learned from my experience running a very large medical group within a hospital organization. Several years ago, not-for-profit hospitals began facing an existential crisis as overall healthcare equipment and labor costs rapidly and steadily increased, while both insurers and employers put tremendous pressure on our payments, which squeezed the hospitals in the middle. This meant that we had a burning platform that forced us to alter our approach from just continuing to provide all of the same services in the same manner as before. Some of the tactics that I saw to be successful included lean methodologies that stress continual improvement. If we could advance this, thank you. These are geared to generate pain points, knowledge, and energy of the frontline staff in a bottoms-up approach and not expecting new ideas to be handed down from on high. While these methodologies were initially created to make manufacturing more efficient and deliver a quality product, these same precepts can also help nonprofit and governmental agencies improve your workflow and services. Fundamental to this is the plan, do, check, act, repeating cycle of continual learning and reapplying this process to make it a living thing and not something that is a one-time effort. This means that you develop a plan, you do the implementation, you check the results, and then you adjust or act accordingly. However, the key is that this is a cycle and you do this over and over again, addressing a single issue until it is fully addressed. A big avenue for change, as Charlie alluded to earlier, is being relentless on asking what are the sacred cows or third rails that are no longer sacred given that our fundamental paradigm is changing and it impacts the entire organization. Our change in circumstances now can be a way for you to propose changes that you felt long might be needed, but didn't have the impetus to be able to work through your bureaucracy. Using a tool like the 7 whys to try and peel back layers of why you do work in a certain way or provide certain services can help get to the root of issues to be addressed and potentially changed. To do this, keep asking why at least 7 times, and it may be painful the first time or two you try it, but I really encourage you to use this tool to really dig into why is it that we do work a certain way and why can't we do it a different way, or perhaps not even do it at all. Instituting a governance structure to be able to limit the number of large initiatives at one time in your organization that take not only financial resources, but also the time required by people, by leadership, by IT, by human resources, by your staff, and protect your people from burning out. If you have fewer employees or resources in the future, what projects you accomplish in a given time frame may also need to change. And last, we also had to look at what the long-range cost implications were when things such as mandatory electronic health reporting, outcome-based insurance payments, et cetera, came into play. Like Charlie mentioned earlier, this meant modeling what various scenarios would be given the big swings that certain things would have, such as the implementation of the ACA or not, state legislation, et cetera. What you should be asking and modeling today is what COVID might mean for revenues, pension payments, healthcare costs, et cetera.
Eric, that's a wonderful explanation and detail to add to Charlie's previous points. And as we go through this, I'm going to open up another slide, and I think it's a good time to open up some of the questions from the audience that have been posed. So as this one's being voted on now, one of the questions that was asked earlier, and either one of you can jump in based upon your knowledge, is when is the government revised assumptions available?
So I'm not sure the question of government revised assumptions on what, on the economy, or?
That question seemed to come through when you were referring to the pension and investment return, Charlie.
Oh, well, you know, I'm just not sure. I just know that that I monitor all of this constantly, and I'm continually posting, sharing, and writing about this on my LinkedIn page, which I encourage everyone on the call to connect with me on, because I only share information that I think is valuable for local government financial managers. As the announcement, that's where I got a lot of my data for the presentation today, and it's information that, you know, I think is just going to be really helpful as we move through this crisis together.
Thank you for that, Charlie. And it sounds like keeping up with what's going on in the news is also helpful, but especially for when it comes down to any kind of assumption changes or releases. I'm certain that the information can be found online, but as we go through this with our viewers, we'll be pulling together those questions and providing answers as well on our page. So stay tuned for that as well, everyone. We have another question from a viewer. Are there strategies to keep pensions from experiencing dramatic increases in the annual actuarial required contributions?
Oh my goodness, there are more than several strategies. You know, back in 2015, the city of Sausalito was the first city in the nation to put in place a Section 115 trust fund for pensions. And here's what we did back then. Is we asked ourselves the question, what do we think the real rate of return is going to be? What's our actual experience in terms of payroll growth? And then using GovInvest software, we were able to say, you know, here's what we think we should be charging our general fund every year for pension costs, you know, to meet our obligations. And then that's what we charged. It was a lot higher than our annual required contributions coming from CalPERS. So what we did is we put the amount that we charged our general fund into a Section 115 trust fund, and then we paid out of that trust fund whatever the CalPERS required contribution was. What that allowed us to do is to build up annual cushions that built up and up and up and became like a hedge fund against CalPERS losses and gains. So rather than send the money to the agency who lost it in the stock market, our city council wanted local control, and they said, let's have a conservative investment policy, and as a result, didn't experience the losses but didn't get as big a gains either in the good years. In other words, we had a safe pool of money, which I imagine will agencies who have followed that, I think since then 220 agencies have set up Section 115 trusts in California alone, and those trust funds are able now to be drawn upon if our financial resources dwindle next year, and we'll be able to continue making our payments. So happy to talk to anyone individually about how that works. But I had another idea back in 2015, and I've been sharing this idea nationally with some other leaders, and it may be something that the time has come. For example, a long time ago, the city of Sausalito bought a school from a public school district, and we turned it into a rental facility where we had two anchor tenants, a French-speaking language school and a Waldorf school. And then in between the campus, we had local artisans. And that facility, after we restructured it and refinanced it, generated about $1 million a year in income and had a assessed value pretty high if it was on the market. So my thought was, instead of giving money to a pension trust fund, why don't I just take my municipal owned property and put it into the pension trust fund or an OPEB trust fund? And it would, just the value of it alone would be worth the amount of the unfunded liability, immediately eliminating the need for a UAAL payments. And then the revenue from the facility would be enough to make the normal cost of the pension plan. So I think this is an idea whose time has come to explore, of taking municipal assets that are income producing and use the value of the asset to offset the unfunded liability of pension and OPEB plans. So, some of this may need legislation, but at the end, I think it would help our whole economy. So I'm happy to talk about other strategies one-on-one with any of our listeners today about different ways to mitigate future pension costs.
Thank you for that, Charlie. And so from our other conversations and actually looking at the poll results, we do see the majority of people are looking to rework current or future budgets or doing some what-if modeling. But as regarding to pension, we know that labor has an effect to those on salaries and other things that are pensionable. And it looks like we do have some people that may be thinking about reopening current union contracts, starting discussions on workforce reductions and repurposing workers. Tell us a little bit more about how they can think about labor or negotiations with unions to consider, for their budget or for their retirement plans.
Right. So I'll give you an example from how the past informs the present. In 2009, our city was under a collective bargaining agreement to give all of our employees a 5% increase on July 1st. And, that was at a time when it was the last year of a contract. And this was at a time when other cities were cutting workforce. They were opening up labor agreements and abrogating pay increases. We were stopping capital investment. And I thought to myself, this was a covenant we made with our employees. And covenants should not be lightly broken. How can we honor this covenant to establish the trust that we need between labor and management to work collectively together going forward? So the city of Sausalito did that. We honored that labor agreement. We were able to work together through the next 7 years. And in that 7 years, the city and labor agreements, were able to implement the kind of pension reforms, OPEB reform, and healthcare reform and salary reform that put us on the path to fiscal resiliency. So in order to negotiate and look at your agreements, you need contemporary modern day software that can accurately cost out the cost of a labor agreement. And we have tools today that will help you do that.
Fantastic, Charlie, and thank you for elaborating on that. So we have a time for a few more questions, and we see some more coming in. One asked is, how do municipalities that rely almost entirely on tourism find resources to remain solvent and maintain services?
Oh, wow. So Sausalito was a tourism city. It was, a city that had a nighttime population of 7,500 and a daytime population of almost 25,000. And so, of course, you had to provide services to that 25,000, and we relied on tourism revenue. So I think the primary tool that you have as an advanced tool. In other words, having a reserve policy that's based on risk, not the reserve policies that say, they pick an arbitrary number in the air and say 25% of general fund expenditures is the amount of reserves. That is meaningless to me. So what we did is we used the example that came out of Government Finance Review, I think it was back in 2014, where Colorado Springs went through a risk-based review of their reserves. And what I did is I looked at my revenue stream and how volatile it was during economic fluctuations in the economy. And I found that although my tourism revenue was growing at over time, it fluctuated within a $600,000 band on any given recession. So in other words, I had money set aside that was designated to be used when economic recessions occurred in that strategy. So, but if you don't have such a policy in place, there's really not a whole bunch to do. I always find it somewhat, I don't know, humorous or sad when city councils come together and say, oh, we have a deficit of several $1 million, and so we're going to cut out travel expenses and conferences. And when you add that up, it's like $50,000. People don't, it's just like the impact, the biggest expense that we have is our personnel. And I know that we have to continue delivering services, but at some point it just means what people are we going to keep and what people are we not going to keep. And again, I come back to the software that allows us to actually calculate what is the right amount of people to cut from a budget in order to continue providing services. What services can be shared with our neighboring communities? How can they be delivered in alternative forms using volunteers? What levels are? So now we have tools that give us the ability to spend less time collecting data and more time analyzing and getting insight from data, so that when we present our policies and our recommendations to our city council, we have the data to support the evidence that we're giving them to adopt that policy or recommendation.
Charlie, thank you so much for all of your insights. And I want to thank our guests in total, Charlie Francis and Eric Weeks, for taking the time to share their experiences and some ideas that may help governments as they work through these uncertain times. Thank you both.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So that's all the time we have for today. But before we go, I want to ask you, our viewers, for a favor. We're working around the clock speaking with state and local government innovators and subject matter experts to bring the latest information on the coronavirus and its impacts to government. But it would really help us to know what you want to hear more about and who you want to hear it from. So we're asking, please send us an email or voice memo with your request to govtalk@govinvest.com, and we will work to incorporate new topics and speakers on future episodes. That's GovTalk, TALK, @govinvest.com. We're looking forward to hearing from you, and thanks again. We'll see you all next week.